We begin the discussion on an issue making headlines. Economic lockdowns during the COVID-19 crisis have paralysed the automotive supply chain as well as car dealerships across the world. Auto sales have plummeted in major markets, expected to decrease by more than 20% on year in 2020. So how can car makers survive this pandemic, and could they somehow turn the crisis into an opportunity? To find out, we speak with Peter Wells, Professor of Business and Sustainability at the Centre for Automotive Industry Research at Cardiff University. Also joining us is Casey HYUN, Principal of Global Design Index Ltd, who is a award-winning automotive designer and strategist who is the lead designer of Hyundai Genesis G20. Now, my first question to you, Professor Wells. The car industry has been struggling for years with sales falling in all major markets in Europe, the US and even China. So how do you think the car market can actually bounce back as an eventual economic recovery takes place?
Well, you're right to say that the industry has seen something of an opportunity here. We have seen, for example, a growing public reluctance to use public transport. And so the industry is optimistic in that sense. But I think the big picture here is now a lot of questions are being asked about the old car industry. In other words, people have seen the clean air, they've appreciated the peace and quiet. They've asked themselves, do we need that much mobility? Do we need that many cars? Perhaps we could use more active travel or work from home. In other words, there's been a big shift in the public sentiment around the industry. And that means that a simple economic recovery is not the answer anymore. This is an industry that needs to deliver on a green recovery, and that's a much tougher challenge.
Well, Professor HYUN, how do you think that global car companies should innovate to recover from this pandemic, and what kinds of innovations do you hope to see?
I think this COVID-19 pandemic is something that I don't think anyone could have ever imagined to happen. The auto industry is very hard, and we might see something like a leading brand failing to survive. And in terms of regulations and innovations, already governments like UK, France, and China. They're very much into contemplating banning the sales of gasoline and diesel vehicles, even prior to COVID-19, setting the date anywhere between 2030 and 2040, which is a decade to 2 decades away. And I think with these set regulations, I think there will be a number of very revolutionized innovations taking place. I think overall design and looks of the vehicles will be most striking to the general public, while as far as technology and the energy source is concerned, these changes will eventually happen, but maybe at a slower pace.
I see. Well, Professor Wells, sales of electric cars seem to have actually fared better than gasoline or diesel-powered cars. But at the same time, we've seen, do you think that these falling oil prices will at the same time encourage customers to buy more traditional cars as well? Which side do you think will win out?
Well, in the end, it's going to be electric. I think that's quite clear. In a way, bizarrely, the crisis has helped a bit because there were some real supply chain constraints on the industry. It was struggling to meet demand for some key electric models. And it's given time for some manufacturers to finish the development of models, for example, Volkswagen with the ID platform and so on. So in a way, this is a great opportunity for the industry now to make a shift. But I'm curious, I wonder what Professor HYUN thinks about the idea that perhaps in the medium term, we'll see the emergence of much smaller classes of vehicles, micro electric vehicles like the Twizy or like the Citroën Ami, because I can see that as we shift our way of achieving mobility, one of the things that we will do is opt for these smaller single-person, two-person vehicles, which will be much more efficient and fit our congested cities.
What do you think, Professor HYUN? Do you see the emergence of smaller cars?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting question because at the moment, many auto manufacturers, the definition of future mobility is rather vague, and they use it for more cosmetic kind of term. because the future mobility requires less of the conventional technologies and more of the convergence technology, which at the moment none of the automotive manufacturers possess yet. So I think it is generally agreed that the future mobility will require autonomous connectivity, electric and alternative energy propulsion system. No one automotive brand at the moment possess all the necessary skills to call themselves a future mobility brand. So it's still, for me, if I may describe myself, I think this is still a very, a white piece of paper that they're still, waiting to be painted.
Well, we are seeing, as you said, a number of car companies trying to reinvent themselves as mobility companies. So what do you think they're really going to have to do to make that transition?
I guess we can expect two main scenarios, where one is a strategic partnership between leading tech brand and auto brands. And second will be the rise of an industry-defining mobility startup, which is completely independent of conventional auto brands and redefining the way we perceive automobile in a completely different way.
Well, South Korea has been trying to boost its future car industry. And Professor Wells, which global markets do you think its main opportunities lie? And what core strengths do you think that South Korean car makers should actually work on?
Well, I think they obviously, the industry here in Korea needs to build on the advantages it has with respect to electric propulsion and, of course, the huge electronics expertise that's available in the country. The opportunities are huge all around the world. Obviously, some countries are more advanced in terms of the uptake of alternative technologies, and perhaps also the consumers are more prepared to support those sorts of products going forward. So if we look at, say, South America, where I'm currently based, this market is way behind the curve. On the other hand, you're looking into regional markets in the US like California or the old traditional markets in Europe. These are places that are ready to take on new forms of thinking about mobility. But there's one big concern here. Even before the pandemic, car companies and the big kind of independent players were not able to make shared mobility work. And my concern now is that they'll actually pull back from some of that because in the context of having to share vehicles with other individuals, people are going to be very cautious and very nervous. And perhaps that market is going to just disappear and people will want their own mobility again.
I see. Well, Professor HYUN, the same question goes to you. What core strengths do you think that South Korean car makers should work on to be competitive in the global market?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. It is generally agreed that the future car requires three main things, which includes number one, new vehicle energy source, number two, connected and automated vehicle technology and infrastructure, and last but not least, the mass manufacturing capacity. And I think industry-wise, with these three combination already on hand, I think Korean car makers, or a maker, to be technically correct, are in a prime position to start fast and possibly lead the charge for the foreseeable future in its future car industry race globally.
And Professor Wells, Professor HYUN just mentioned some electric vehicles and new batteries, and it does look like there's a shift to new kinds of batteries across the automobile sector. And South Korea has been developing hydrogen fuel cells and electric batteries. Which do you think has the bigger potential?
Well, of course, at the moment, it's a very fluid and very dynamic situation. Just in the world of batteries, technologies are developing very, very quickly. But again, a word of caution. I went to a conference in Canada, it was. It must have been 15 years ago. And the theme of this fuel cell conference, centered on Ballard, the famous fuel cell producer, was, it's coming in the next 3 years. It's coming in the next 3 years. And it's always been coming in the next 3 years. And that's another problem for the industry. I think consumers will, in the end, we'll see a diversification, a split. Some consumers that want long-range, fast travel, the fuel cell is probably a better option, especially for bigger vehicles and into the commercial vehicle segments. Around cities, urban areas, shorter trips, I can see a range of different battery technologies coming through, which will be much more appropriate for that sort of travel. I think we'll see a much more diverse set of vehicles around, many different sorts of technologies, more diverse designs. There's actually going to be more variety in a real sense in the future.
And we've actually seen some movements here in South Korea. Professor Hyun, there was a lot of speculation that Samsung and Hyundai Motor might actually come together, and the leaders there, they discussed possible collaboration on EV batteries. And we heard just yesterday that LG Chemicals is planning to supply Hyundai and Kia with batteries. So what do you think about this possible synergy there? Do you think we'll continue to see these kind of collaborations take place?
Oh, I think that's a very interesting kind of development which we saw last couple of weeks ago. And I wouldn't necessarily call it something which is unorthodox or unexpected. I guess Hyundai, the HMG, Hyundai Motor Group being the 5th largest auto brand in the world, the LG Chem as the world #1, and Samsung SDI is the 4th in EV battery supplier ranking in the first quarter of 2020. Something like this was bound to happen, and if anything was surprising, it was as to why it took so long. So I guess we are set to see much more of these auto and non-auto strategic partnership in the near future, and I think the alternative energy source for the true future mobility of autonomous connectivity and electric vehicle will happen pretty soon, and these partnerships is set to happen more frequently and in a larger and more intimate scale.
Well, it looks like after this pandemic is over, global car companies, they are going to have to do something different and really reinvent themselves. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Peter Wells, Professor of Business at Cardiff University, and Casey HYUN, Principal of Global Design Index Ltd. Thank you so much for joining the programme.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
This is also where we end the show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back at the same time on Monday, Korea time. Till then, have a wonderful weekend wherever you are. Goodbye.